Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, 1916 to 1918. Chapter 1, The High Command. The New Year's light of 1916 rising upon a frantic and miserable world revealed in its full extent the immense battlefield to which Europe was reduced and on which the noblest nations of Christendom mingled in murderous confusion. It was now certain that the struggle would be prolonged to an annihilating conclusion. The enormous forces on either side were so well matched that the injuries they must suffer and inflict in their struggles were immeasurable. There was no escape. All the combatants in both combinations were gripped in a vice from which no single state could extricate itself. The northern provinces of France, invaded and in German occupation, inspired the French people with a commanding impulse to drive the enemy from their soil. The trench lines on which the armies were in deadlock ran, not along the frontiers, where perhaps parley would not have been impossible, but through the heart of France. The appeal to clear the national territory from foreign oppression went home to every cottage and steeled every heart. Germany, on the other hand, while her armies stood almost everywhere on conquered territory, could not in the full flush of her strength yield what she had gained with so much blood, nor pay forfeit for her original miscalculations, nor make reparation for the wrong she had done. Any German dynasty or government which had proposed so wise and righteous a course would have been torn to pieces. The French losses and the German conquests of territory thus equally compelled a continuance of the struggle by both nations. A similar incentive operated upon Russia, and in addition the belief that defeat meant revolution hardened all governing resolves. In Britain, obligations of honor to her suffering allies, and particularly to Belgium, forbade the slightest suggestion of slackening or withdrawal. And behind this decisive claim of honor there welled up from the heart of the island race a fierce suppressed passion and resolve for victory at all costs and at all risks, latent since the downfall of Napoleon. Not less peremptory were the forces dominating the other parties to the struggle. Italy had newly entered the war upon promises which offered her a dazzling reward. These promises were embodied in the Pact of London. They involved conditions to which Austria-Hungary could never submit without final ruin as a great power. The acceptance by Britain and France of the Russian claim to Constantinople condemned Turkey to a similar fate. Failure meant therefore to both the Austrian and the Turkish empires not only defeat but dissolution. As for Bulgaria, she could only expect from the victory of the Allies the dire measure she had meted to Serbia. Thus in every quarter the stakes were desperate or even mortal, and each of the vast confederacies was riveted together within itself, and each part chained to its respective foe by bonds which only the furnace of war could fuse or blast away. Wealth, science, civilization, patriotism, steam transport, and world credit enabled the whole strength of every belligerent to be continually applied to the war. The entire populations fought and labored, women and men alike, to the utmost of their physical destructiveness. National industry was in every country converted to the production of war material. Tens of millions of soldiers, scores of thousands of cannon, hurled death across battle lines, themselves measured in thousands of miles. Havoc on such a scale had never even been dreamt of in the past, and had never proceeded at such a speed in all human history. To carry this process to the final limit was the dearest effort of every nation, and of nearly all that was best and noblest in every nation. But at the same time that Europe had been fastened into this frightful bondage, the art of war had fallen into an almost similar helplessness. No means of procuring a swift decision presented itself to the strategy of the commanders, or existed on the battlefields of the armies. The chains which held the warring nations to their task were not destined to be severed by military genius. No sufficient preponderance of force was at the disposal of either side. No practical method of a decisive offensive had been discovered, and the ill-directed fires of war, leaving the fetters unbroken, preyed through fatal years upon the flesh of the captive nations. In August 1914, the name Joffre broke for the first time on British ears. Nothing was known of him then except that he was the proclaimed and accepted chief of the armies of France, in that hour of her mortal peril, which we had determined to share. Seeing that the existence of France was at stake, and trusting in the historic war science of the French army, the British government and people gave their confidence frankly and fully to this massive new personage, who emerged so suddenly from the recesses of the French War Office and strode forward calmly towards the advancing storm. Who was he, and how did he come to be there at the summit in the supreme hour? What qualities had he shown? What deeds had he done? What forces did he combine or compel? Through what chances and trials had he passed, on his road to almost the greatest responsibility in the realm of violent action which ever enveloped one man? To answer such questions, it is necessary to retrace the steps of history for some distance. Early in 1911, General Michel, Vice President of the Superior Council of War and Commander-in-Chief, designate of the French army in the event of war, drew up a report upon the plan of campaign. He declared that Germany would certainly attack France through Belgium, that her turning movement would not be limited to the southern side of the Belgian Meuse, but would extend far beyond it, comprising Brussels and Antwerp in its scope. He affirmed that the German General Staff would use immediately not only their 21 active army corps, but in addition the greater part of the 21 reserve corps, which, it was known, they intended to form on general mobilization. France should therefore be prepared to meet an immense turning movement through Belgium and a hostile army which would comprise at the outset the greater part of 42 army corps. To confront this invasion, he proposed that the French should organize and use a large proportion of their own reserve from the very beginning. For this purpose, he desired to create a reserve formation at the side of each active formation, and to make both units take the field together under the officer commanding the active unit. By this means, the strength of the French army on mobilization would be raised from 1,300,000 to 2 million, and the German invading army would be confronted with at least equal numbers. Many of the French corps would be raised to 70,000 men, and most of the regiments would become brigades of 6 battalions. These forces General Michel next proceeded to distribute. He proposed to place his greatest mass, nearly 500,000 strong, between Lille and Avesnes, to counter the main strength of the German turning movement. He placed a second mass of 300,000 men on the right of the first between Hirson and Rethel. He assigned 220,000 men for the garrison of Paris, which was also to act as the general reserve. His remaining troops were disposed along the eastern frontier. Such was the plan in 1911 of the leading soldier of France. These ideas ran directly counter to the mainstream of French military thought. The General Staff did not believe that Germany would make a turning movement through Belgium, certainly not through northern Belgium. They did not believe that the Germans would use their reserve formations in the opening battles. They did not believe that reserve formations could possibly be made capable of taking part in the struggle until after a prolonged period of training. They held, on the contrary, that the Germans, using only their active army, would attack with extreme rapidity and must be met and forestalled by a French counter-thrust across the eastern frontier. For this purpose, the French should be organized with as large a proportion of soldiers actually serving and as few reservists as possible, and with this end in view, they demanded the institution of the 3-year service law, which would ensure the presence of at least 2 complete contingents of young soldiers. The dominant spirits of the French staff, apart from their chief, belonged to the offensive school, of whom the most active apostle was Colonel de Grosmasson, and believed ardently that victory could be compelled from the first moment by a vehement and furious rush upon the foe. This collision of opinion was fatal to General Michel. It may be that his personality and temperament were not equal to the profound and penetrating justice of his ideas. Such discrepancies have often marred true policies. An overwhelming combination was formed against him by his colleagues on the Council of War. During the tension of Agadir, the issue reached a head. The new Minister of War, Colonel Messimy, insisted upon a discussion of the Michel scheme in full council. The Vice President found himself alone. Almost every other general declared his direct disagreement. In consequence of this, he was a few days later informed by the War Minister that he did not possess the confidence of the French army, and on July 23 he resigned the position of Vice President of the War Council. It had been intended by the government that Michel should be succeeded either by Gallieni or Paul. But Paul made claims to the appointing of general officers which the minister would not accept. His nomination was not proceeded with, ostensibly on the score of his age, and this pretext once given was still more valid against Gallieni, who was older. It was in these circumstances that the choice fell upon General Joffre. Joffre was an engineer officer who, after various employments in Madagascar under Gallieni and in Morocco, had gained a reputation as a well-balanced, silent, solid man, and who in 1911 occupied a seat in the Superior Council of War. It would have been difficult to find any figure more unlike the British idea of a Frenchman than this bull-headed, broad-shouldered, slow-thinking, phlegmatic, bucolic personage. Or would it have been easy to find a type which at the first view would have seemed less suited to weave or unravel the profound and gigantic webs of modern war? He was the junior member of the War Council. He had never commanded an army nor directed great maneuvers even in a war game. In such exercises he had played the part of Inspector General of the lines of communication, and to this post he was at that time assigned on mobilization. Joffre received the proposal for his tremendous appointment with misgiving and embarrassment, which were both natural and creditable. His reluctances were overcome by the assurance that General de Castelnau, who was deeply versed in the plans and theories of the French staff and in the great operations of war, would be at his special disposal. Joffre therefore assumed power as the nominee of the dominant elements in the French staff and as the exponent of their doctrines. To this conception he remained constantly loyal, and the immense disasters which France was destined to suffer 3 years later became from that moment almost inevitable. General Joffre's qualities, however, fitted him to render most useful service to the various fleeting French administrations which preceded the conflict. He represented the embodied stability in a world of change, and impartiality in a world of faction. He was a good Republican, with a definite political view, without being a political soldier, or one who dealt in intrigue. No one could suspect him of religion, but neither, on the other hand, could anyone accuse him of favoring atheist generals at the expense of Catholics. Here, at any rate, was something for France, with her politicians chattering, fuming, and frothing along to Armageddon, to rest her hand upon. For nearly 3 years, and under successive governments, Joffre continued to hold his post, and we are assured that his advice on technical matters was almost always taken by the various ministers who flitted across the darkening scene. He served under Caillaux and Massimy. He served under Poincaré and Millerand. He served under Briand and Etienne. He was still serving under Viviani and Massimy again when the explosion came. Reference had already been made in the first volume to the immense miscalculations and almost fatal errors made by General Joffre, or in his name, in the first great collision of the war. The withering winds of French criticism have pitilessly exposed the deformities of Plan 17. The Germans, as General Michel had predicted, made their vast turning movement through Belgium. They brought into action almost immediately 34 army corps, of which 13, or their equivalent, were reserve formations. Of the 2 million men who marched to invade France and Belgium, 700,000 only were serving conscripts and 1,300,000 were reservists. Against these, General Joffre could muster only 1,300,000, of whom also 700,000 were serving conscripts, but only 600,000 reservists. 1,200,000 additional French reservists responded immediately to the national call, encumbering the depots, without equipment, without arms, without cadres, without officers. In consequence, the Germans outnumbered the French at the outbreak by 3 to 2 along the whole line of battle, and as they economized their forces on their left, they were able to deliver the turning movement on their right in overwhelming strength. At Charleroi, they were 3 to 1. The strategic aspect of General Joffre's policy was not less stultified than the administrative. The easterly and northeasterly attacks, into which his 4 armies of the right and center were impetuously launched, were immediately stopped and hurled back with a slaughter so frightful that it has never yet been comprehended by the world. His left army, the 5th, and a group of 3 reserve divisions, sent at the last moment to its aid, together with the British army, were simultaneously forced back and turned. They only escaped complete envelopment and destruction by the timely retreat which General Lanrezac and Sir John French executed each independently on his own initiative, and also by the most stubborn resistance and effective rifle fire of the highly trained professional British infantry. To General Lanrezac, for his complete grasp of the situation and courageous order of retreat, the gratitude of France is due. It was for the tactical sphere that General Joffre and his school of young Turks, as they came to be called in France, had reserved their crowning mistakes. The French infantry marched into battle, conspicuous on the landscape in their red breeches and blue coats. Their artillery officers in black and gold were even more sharply defined targets. The doctrine of the offensive, raised to the height of a religious frenzy, animated all ranks, and in no rank was restrained by any foreknowledge of the power of magazine rifles and machine guns. A cruel shock lay before them. The Third French Army, marching towards Arlon, blundered into the Germans in the morning mist of August 22, 4 or 5 of its divisions having their hats shorn away while they were still close to their camping grounds. Everywhere along the battlefront, whenever Germans were seen, the signal was given to charge. Vive la France, à la baïonnette, en avant. And the brave troops, nobly led by their regimental officers, who sacrificed themselves in even greater proportion, responded in all the magnificent fighting fury for which the French nation had been traditionally renowned. Sometimes these hopeless onslaughts were delivered to the strains of the Marseillaise, 6, 7, or even 800 yards from the German positions. Though the Germans invaded, it was more often the French who attacked. Long swathes of red and blue corpses littered the stubble fields. The collision was general along the whole battlefront, and there was a universal recoil. In the mighty battle of the frontiers, the magnitude and terror of which is scarcely known to British consciousness, more than 300,000 Frenchmen were killed, wounded, or made prisoners. However, General Joffre preserved his sang-froid amid these disastrous surprises to an extent which critics have declared almost indistinguishable from insensibility. Unperturbed by his own responsibility, he dismissed incompetent or even competent subordinates in all quarters. He issued orders for a general retreat of the French armies, which contemplated their withdrawal before resuming the offensive, not merely behind the Marne, but behind the Seine, and comprised the isolation or abandonment both of Paris and of Verdun. While these plans were in progress, there occurred the much-debated intervention of General Gallieni, the newly constituted governor of Paris. A whole library of French literature is extant on this famous episode. The partisans of Gallieni seek to prove their case by letters, telegrams, telephonic conversations, orders, and established facts. The champions of Joffre minimize these assertions and rest themselves on the solid declaration that nothing can divert the credit of the victory from the bearer of the prime responsibility. From these claims it is possible to draw a reasonable conclusion. The overriding responsibility of the Supreme Commander remains unassailable. It cannot be more convincingly expressed than in words attributed to Joffre himself. Indiscreetly asked, "Who won the Battle of the Marne?" he is said to have replied, "That, madame, is a difficult question, but I know who would have lost it, supposing it had been lost." Joffre and the French headquarters were withdrawing their armies with the avowed intention of turning on their pursuers and fighting a decisive battle at an early date. Exactly when or where they would fight they had not determined. All the armies were in constant contact, and everything was in flux. But certainly they contemplated making their supreme effort at some moment when the 5 pursuing German armies were between the horns of Paris and Verdun. Gallieni's intervention decided this moment, and decided it gloriously. He it was who had insisted on the defense of the capital when Joffre had advocated declaring it an open town. He had inspired the government to order Joffre to place a field army at his disposal for its defense. When the endless columns of the right-hand German army skirting Paris turned southeast, he decided instantly to strike at their exposed flank with his whole force. He set all his troops in motion towards the east. He convinced Joffre that the moment had come to strike, and he persuaded him that the flanking thrust should be made to the north rather than to the south of the Marne, as Joffre had purposed. Finally, he struck his blow with all the sureness and spontaneity of military genius, and the blow heralded the battle whose results saved Europe. When a commander-in-chief in a crisis of war had been demonstrably persuaded to alter his plans by a subordinate of the highest rank, his senior in service, almost his equal in authority, and when this alteration had been followed by a victory of supreme importance, it is evident that the materials of controversy will not be lacking. After the Marne, there was a breathing space, and immediately the voice of criticism was raised against the strategy and conduct of General Joffre. To the failure of his war plans and to the dispute about the credit of the Marne was added the charge of defective preparation for war. No other Frenchman had sat in one great position for the 3 years before the war. No other man had his responsibility for the condition of the French military resources. The scarcity of machine guns, the want of heavy artillery, the absence even of field service uniforms could all be laid at his door rather than at any other. Not that it follows that anyone else would have done better. Thus, while to the world public and before the enemy, and, it must be added, in the eyes of the rank and file of the French armies, Joffre towered up as a grand figure, triumphing over the tempest and the victor of the greatest and most decisive battle of history. There flowed all the time a strong subterranean current of well-informed mistrust and opposition. Joffre, if not a heaven-born general, was unquestionably an impressive personality. His position had become firmly established in relation to the grand scale of events. His sense of proportion had from the outset been extended to the limits of the whole battlefield. No other living man had had the advantages of his standpoint or environment. He was accustomed to think only in terms of armies and groups of armies. All the other frenzied and frightful detail was definitely beneath his consciousness, as it was beneath his sphere of duty. Allied to the supreme outlook, which necessarily only a few men in any country can enjoy, Joffre had the physique and temperament exactly suited to the kind of strains he had to bear and the scale of the decisions he had to take. On these solid foundations, the splendid position which he occupied and the tremendous events over which he presided soon built up a vast prestige. The censorship, for reasons which certainly had weight, discouraged or forbade both in France and in England the writing up of any generals except the commander-in-chief in each country. Thus the population of the Allied countries knew only Joffre, and even in France it was to Joffre, and Joffre above all others, that the trusting faith of the multitude was month by month and year by year deliberately and mechanically directed. Nevertheless, as the weary months of trench warfare in 1915 passed away, diversified only by the costly failures of the French offensive in Artois in the spring and in Champagne in the autumn, the currents of hostility gathered continually in volume and intensity. The great popularity of Millerand, who became Minister for War in the early days of the struggle, was slowly sapped through his unswerving loyalty to Joffre. And upon the reconstitution of the French government under Briand at the end of October 1915, Millerand disappeared from the scene. He was succeeded as Minister of War by none other than Gallieni. The relations between Joffre and the new minister were remarkable. Only age had prevented Gallieni from occupying the supreme post at the outbreak of the war. Joffre had actually served under his orders in a minor capacity in Madagascar. On the declaration of war, Gallieni had received a letter from the minister, approved by Joffre, appointing him Joffre's successor should the command of the French armies fall vacant. The extraordinary part played by Gallieni in the crisis of the Marne has been briefly indicated here, and Joffre was certainly not unconscious of the claims that might arise from it. No sooner was the victory won than he withdrew the Sixth Army from the control of Gallieni, leaving him again simply governor of Paris. When in December 1915 the French armies were formed into two groups, Gallieni was anxious to be called to the command of one of them. But Joffre's choice fell elsewhere. Some months later, when the command of the Sixth Army fell vacant, it was offered to Gallieni. But seeing that this command was only a fraction of what he had directed in the Battle of the Marne, Gallieni put the proposal on one side. Finally, on October 1, 1915, Joffre, wishing to place on record once for all his views of Gallieni's contribution to the great victory, had caused to be published in the Gazette a citation which gave widespread offense. Footnote.
Et cité à l'ordre de l'armée. Gallieni, général, gouverneur militaire et commandant des armées de Paris, commandant du camp retranché et des armées de Paris, et placé le 2 septembre 1914 sous les ordres du commandant en chef, a fait preuve des plus hautes qualités militaires, en contribuant, par les renseignements qu'il avait recueillis, à déterminer la direction de marche prise par l'aile droite allemande, en orientant judicieusement, pour participer à la bataille, les forces mobiles à sa disposition, en facilitant, par tous les moyens en son pouvoir, l'accomplissement de la mission assignée par le commandant en chef à ses forces mobiles.
Which says, translated by Google, the following is cited in the army orders. Gallieni, General, Military Governor and Commander of the Armies of Paris, Commander of the Entrenched Camp and the Armies of Paris, and placed on September 2, 1914, under the command of the commanding officer, demonstrated the highest military qualities. By contributing, through the intelligence he had gathered, to determining the direction of advance taken by the German right wing, by judiciously directing the mobile forces at his disposal to participate in the battle, by facilitating by all means in his power the accomplishment of the mission assigned by the Commander-in-Chief to these mobile forces. End of footnote. Gallieni's comment is said to have been, "I could never serve again under the orders of Joffre." But in October 1915, the roles are swiftly reversed, and it is Gallieni who holds the superior position not only as Minister of War, but as a greater soldier and, in the eyes of many, a greater hero. In the brief portion of Gallieni's life, which was lived on the world stage, no feature bears the sign of true greatness more than his treatment of Joffre. Convinced by Briand that Joffre, whatever his shortcomings, was at that time necessary to the national defense, he supported him in every conceivable manner in the field, and defended him in the chamber on numerous occasions with loyal comradeship. But while thus, to the confusion of his own friends and admirers, he paralyzed for the time being the hostile movement against Joffre, Gallieni did not fail as a minister to press for a reform of the many abuses and usurpations of power which had grown up in the Grand Quartier Général at Chantilly. Such was the situation in the French High Command at the period at which this volume begins, when Kitchener was feverishly seeking to defend Egypt and Falkenhayn was writing a memorandum about Verdun. Every great nation in times of crisis has its own way of doing things. The Germans looked to their Kaiser, the All-Highest, whose word was law, but they also looked after him. In some way or other, the changing group of dominating personalities at the head of the German Empire worked the imperial oracle. We too in England have our own methods, more difficult to explain to foreigners perhaps than any others, and on the whole more inchoate, more crude, more clumsy. Still, they work. And there is also the French method. Studying French war politics, one is struck first of all by their extreme complexity. The number of persons involved, the intricacy of their relations, the swiftness and yet the smoothness with which their whole arrangement is continually changed, all baffle the stranger during the event, and weary him afterwards in the tale. The prevailing impression is that of a swarm of bees, all buzzing together, and yet each bee, or nearly every bee, with a perfectly clear idea of what has got to be done in the practical interest of the hive. At the end of 1915 there were two very definite convictions established in the wide secret circles of France: ministers, lobbies, army, press, society, which were actually concerned in the national defense. The first was that Joffre was not Napoleon. The second, that his name and fame constituted an invaluable asset to France. Unity of command was not yet within the bounds of possibility. Unity of front, all the fronts in one relation, was already a watchword. If this was not to be achieved, and if France was to gain or keep control of the strategy of the Allied powers in all the conferences and joint decisions that were necessary to coherent military action, what martial figurehead could she produce comparable to Joffre? France, the France that was conducting the war and fighting for life and honor, believed that the name Joffre and the presence of Joffre would impress and dominate the inexperienced, but on the whole well-meaning English, and carry weight with the remote colossus of Russia. But they did not like the idea of his leading their remaining armies into further offensives. How then to combine the two desirables? On this basis, and with this object, a prolonged series of delicate, subtle processes, maneuvers, and devices were elaborated. Joffre was to be made a general of generals, established in Paris out of contact with any particular army, his eye ranging over all, presiding over every inter-allied military conference, brought forward by the French government to pronounce with commanding authority to Allied cabinets or statesmen, while the actual conduct of the French armies against Germany would be trusted to someone else. To this end, and as a first step, Joffre was appointed in November 1915 to the command of all the French armies, whether in France or in the Orient, and Castelnau was made Major General at headquarters, an appointment which was intended to carry with it, in the highest possible sense, the attributes of Chief of the Staff, with an implied reversion of the supreme command in France. The end of the year brought also a change in the command of the British armies in France. We have seen in what circumstances and with what misgivings Sir John French had allowed himself to be involved in the previous September at Loos in the unwisdom of the great French offensive in Champagne. He had conformed with loyalty and ultimately even with ardor to the wishes of Lord Kitchener and to the acquiescence of the British cabinet. But all this stood him in no stead on the morrow of failure. Those who had not the conviction or resolution to arrest the forlorn attack became easily censorious of its conduct after the inevitable failure. During the course of December, proceedings were set on foot by which, at the end of the year, Sir John French was transferred from the command of the British Army in France to that of the forces at home, and succeeded in that high situation by the commander of his First Army, Sir Douglas Haig. These chapters will recount the fall from dazzling situation of many eminent men. And it is perhaps worthwhile at this point to place the reader on his guard against unworthy or uncharitable judgments. The Great War wore out, or justly or unjustly cast aside, leaders in every sphere as lavishly as it squandered the lives of private soldiers. French, Kitchener, Joffre, Nivelle, Cardona, Jellicoe, Asquith, Briand, Painlevé, and many others, even in the victorious states. All made their contribution and fell. Whatever the pain at the moment to individuals, there are no circumstances of humiliation in such supersessions. Only those who succeeded, who lived through the convulsion and emerged prosperously at the end, know by what obscure twists and turns of chance they escaped a similar lot. Those two impostors, triumph and disaster, never played their prank more shamelessly than in the Great War. When men have done their duty and done their best, have shirked no labor and flinched from no decision that it was their task to take, there is no disgrace in eventual personal failure. They are but good comrades who fall in the earlier stages of an assault, which others, profiting by their efforts and experiences, ultimately carry to victory. Alike in personal efficiency and professional credentials, Sir Douglas Haig was the first officer of the British Army. He had obtained every qualification, gained every experience, and served in every appointment requisite for the general command. He was a cavalry officer of social distinction and independent means, whose whole life had been devoted to military study and practice. He had been adjutant of his regiment. He had played in its polo team. He had passed through the Staff College. He had been Chief Staff Officer to the Cavalry Division in the South African War. He had earned a brevet and decorations in the field. He had commanded a column. He had held a command in India. He had served at the War Office. He had commanded at Aldershot the 2 divisions which formed the only organized British Army Corps, and from this position he had led the 1st British Army Corps to France. He had borne the principal fighting part in every battle during Sir John French's command. At the desperate crisis of the First Battle of Ypres, British battalions and batteries, wearied, outnumbered, and retreating, had been inspirited by the spectacle of the corps commander riding slowly forward at the head of his whole staff along the shell-swept Menin road into close contact with the actual fighting line. It was impossible to assemble around any other officer a series of appointments and qualifications in any way comparable in their cumulative effects with these. He had fulfilled with exceptional credit every requirement to which the pre-war British military hierarchy attached importance. For many years, and at every stage in his career, he had been looked upon alike by superiors and equals as a man certain to rise, if he survived, to the summit of the British Army. Colonel Henderson, the biographer of Stonewall Jackson, professor at the Staff College during Haig's graduation, had predicted this event. His conduct in the first year of the war had vindicated every hope. His appointment as commander-in-chief on the departure of Sir John French created no surprise, aroused no heart-burnings, excited no jealousy. The military profession reposed in him a confidence which the varied fortunes, disappointments, and miscalculations attendant upon 3 years of war on the greatest scale left absolutely unshaken. The esteem of his military colleagues found a healthy counterpart in his own self-confidence. He knew the place was his by merit and by right. He knew he had no rivals, and that he owed his place neither to favor nor usurpation. This attitude of mind was invaluable. Allied to a resolute and equable temperament, it enabled him to sustain with composure not only the shocks of defeat and disaster at the hands of the enemy, but those more complex and not less wearing anxieties arising from his relations with French allies and British cabinets. He was as sure of himself at the head of the British Army as a country gentleman on the soil which his ancestors had trod for generations, and to whose cultivation he had devoted his life. But the Great War owned no master. No one was equal to its vast and novel issues. No human hand controlled its hurricanes. No eye could pierce its whirlwind dust clouds. In the course of this narrative, it is necessary in the interests of the future to seek and set forth in all sincerity what are believed to be the true facts and values. But when this process is complete, the fact remains that no other subject of the king could have endured the ordeal which was his lot with the phlegm, the temper, and the fortitude of Sir Douglas Haig. The failure of the Dardanelles expedition was fatal to Lord Kitchener. During the whole of 1915, he had been in sole and plenary charge of the British military operations, and until November, on every important point, his will had been obeyed. The new cabinet, like the leading members of the old, had now in their turn lost confidence in his war direction. The conduct of the Gallipoli campaign showed only too plainly the limitations of this great figure at this period of his life and in this tremendous situation, both as an organizer and a man of action. His advocacy of the offensive in France, which had failed so conspicuously at Loos and in Champagne, was upon record. Under the agony of the Gallipoli evacuation, his willpower had plainly crumpled, and the long series of contradictory resolves which had marked his treatment of this terrible question was obvious to all who knew the facts. Already in November had come direct rebuff. His plan for a fresh landing in the Gulf of Alexandretta, though devised by him in the actual theatre of operations, had been decisively vetoed by the new War Committee of the Cabinet and by the Allies in conference. In a series of telegrams, the inclination of which could scarcely be obscure, he was encouraged to transform his definite mission at the Dardanelles into a general and extensive tour of inspection in the East. His prompt return to London showed that he was not himself unaware of the change in his position. The disposition of the British forces in the East, which he made after the evacuation of Suvla and Anzac, was certainly not such as to retrieve a waning prestige. It was natural that Egypt should loom disproportionately large in his mind. Almost his whole life had been spent and his fame won there. He now saw his beloved country menaced, as he believed, by an imminent Turkish invasion on a large scale. In an endeavor to ward off the imaginary peril, he crowded division after division into Egypt, and evidently contemplated desperate struggles for the defense of the Suez Canal, at no distant date. In the early days at the end of 1914 and beginning of 1915, it had been worthwhile for a score of thousand Turks to threaten the canal and create as much disturbance as possible in order to delay the movement of troops from India, Australia, and New Zealand to the European battlefield. But both the usefulness and feasibility of such an operation were destroyed by the great increase in the scale of the war in the eastern Mediterranean theatre, which had been in progress during the whole year. The German and Turkish staffs were well content to rely upon threats and boasting, and to make the proclamation of their intention a substitute for the division of armies. "Egypt," exclaimed Enver Pasha in December, "is our objective." And following this simple deception, the British concentration in Egypt was vehemently pursued. On the top of this came the reverse in Mesopotamia, for which Lord Kitchener had no direct responsibility. General Townshend had marched on Baghdad, and the War Committee was led to believe that he was himself the mainspring of the enterprise. General Nixon, the commander-in-chief in Mesopotamia, had not informed them that his audacious and hitherto brilliantly successful subordinate had in writing recorded his misgivings about the operation. In the event, Townshend's force, of about 20,000 men, was on November 25 forced to retreat after a well-contested action at Ctesiphon, and only escaped by a swift and disastrous retreat to a temporary refuge at Kut. On December 3, the War Committee determined to recreate the Imperial General Staff at the War Office in an effective form. The decision was drastic. The experiment of making a Field Marshal Secretary of State for War had run its full course. Lord Kitchener might still hold the seals of office, but his power, hitherto so overwhelming that it had absorbed and embodied the authority alike of the ministerial and of the professional chiefs, was now to be confined within limits which few politicians would accept in a Secretaryship of State. Sir William Robertson, Chief of the General Staff in France, was brought to Whitehall, and an order in council was issued establishing his rights and responsibility in terms both strict and wide. Lord Kitchener acquiesced in the abrogation not only of the exceptional personal powers which he had enjoyed, but of those which have always been inherent in the office which he retained. The end of his great story is approaching. The long life, full of action, lighted by hard-won achievement, crowned by power such as a British subject had rarely wielded, and all the regard and honor that Britain and her empire can bestow, was now declining through the shadows. The sudden onrush of the night, the deep waters of the north, were destined to preserve him and his renown from the shallows. Better to sink beneath the shock than moulder piecemeal on the rock. The solemn days when he stood forth as Constable of Britain beneath whose arm her untrained people braced themselves for war were ended. His life of duty could only reach its consummation in a warrior's death. His record in the Great War as strategist, administrator, and leader will be judged by the eyes of other generations than our own. Let us hope they will also remember the comfort his character and personality gave to his countrymen in their hours of hardest trial.